Okay, so welcome. Thanks for joining us. And I'd like to just begin by introducing Neil, who's dialing in today from New Zealand, and joining us as guests to reflect on the interview that I did with Neil recently. We've got Mary Crossan dialing in from Canada, and John Maguire, who's here in the UK with me. We've got a few people on the call from different parts of the world as well, and we'll begin our sort of dialogue with, first of all, some reflections from John. And for the people who didn't get a chance to watch the interview, the pre-recorded interview, John will give some personal reflections and something of an overview of what we covered in the interview generally. I'm going to ask John if he would introduce himself to begin with and then just give his reflections. That would be great. John, can I hand over to you?
You can indeed. It's a good evening, a good afternoon, a good morning, because you all seem to be potted all over the planet, which is fantastic. It's an honour to share this room with you all, especially Neil and Mary. It's an honour to be talking alongside you today. I'm John Maguire. I currently work for a not-for-profit think tank called Tomorrow's Company. Tomorrow's Company's been around for about 35 years, championing business as a force for good. I joined them a few years ago to introduce an education department. So the aim was to reinvigorate the teaching of business as a force for good. And from that, we are imminently about to release and launch our own independent, not-for-profit charity that works with young people, that uses business as a force for good to teach what we consider to be a range of essential skills and aptitudes. It's not designed specifically for the students that we work with. It's just that we have the most impact with young people from low-income families and those that are living with special educational needs, largely because we want to work with the young people that need the most support to reach their full potential. And we do that within schools, creating these little local communities and local clusters of all stakeholders. So the schools, the parents, the young people, and most importantly, a network of local businesses that we bring in to contextualize and bring our educational programs to life. And that helps the young people to connect to the outer world, and they also build a professional network. So when they do leave school, they've got this really interesting group of like-minded, very friendly businesses that they can call upon for work experience or references or employment. And we find that just makes the world of work a bit smaller and a bit less scary, lots more accessible, and it kind of demystifies and destigmatizes a lot of worries and concerns that these young people have. We work based on the statistic that there's about 100,000 young people every year that leave school without the qualifications they need to lead a full and worthwhile life. So that our overall mission is to work to reduce that number. And what was really interesting about the interview that I watched with Neil was how aligned our mission and our purpose is. And for those that haven't seen the interview, there's a really nice, very tiny introduction to Neil's life at school and college and going into his first world of work. And it's just really interesting to see how somebody else on the other side of the world actually has come to the same place and the same values and the same point from a completely different way. We all seem to have trod a very different path and come to the same location. So it's lots of what was said really, really resonated. What was worrying about it was that everybody I've spoken to who's in the education space like we are, that's fighting against these issues, is that not much is changing. We are trying to put out lots and lots of little mini fires. We're all doing the best we can, and we're having these wins, but actually for the last 40, 50 years, the landscape is changing very little. So I obviously won't go through the hour and a half full interview you did with Neil, but I can give you, and I've pulled out some
Before you,
pieces there.
sorry, just before you go on, could you just explain what that like short life story was that that was relevant and why
Yeah,
it was
so
relevant?
I'll go through sort of the key bits that I've pulled off that video, and
Yeah.
what I'll probably do is come back to some of these sort of these key quotes that I pulled out, and it does begin right at the beginning there, where I actually wrote it down on my screen. So forgive me for reading notes on my second screen, but you said right at the beginning, Neil, that you were not a high flyer, but that you had talents. And I thought that was very telling of school life, that you could have talents and still not be a high flyer. It was quite a mild foreboding of what you were about to talk about over the next hour. That school, as you said, was about schooling and not education, and that these two things seem to be quite separate: the learning and the doing and the values. And I think it was really interesting that you used those words, that you were talented but not a high flyer. And those two things were always split. And you also went on to say that you wanted to be an actor, you loved acting, and that you found a passion for communication. And that is quite simply my pathway from school was exactly the same. As I wanted to be an actor or a filmmaker, and I was told that I should get a proper job. And I wasn't allowed to go to university to do the thing I wanted to do. I was told to go and do computer science with business studies and find a university that had a good amateur dramatics department so I could do my acting as a bit of a hobby, but it definitely wasn't a proper job. And that was just awful advice at 16 or 17. I look back on that with great disdain. So I found that really interesting that you'd had a very similar pathway there, but you'd found your way back to your true calling. And you very early noted that you'd found a hero in Peter Long, if I've got that correct, and that you knew quite early on that you wanted to be a teacher. So you left school at 16, went to college, learned how to be a teacher, and you'd made a note there, I think, that learning was easy because you found something that energized you. And I think that, to me, is the key to education. It's something I will definitely come back to when I actually start delivering some more reflections. But that was a really interesting point that you'd made, that the learning became easy because you found something that energized you. Another key point I found was that you found the biggest impact would be at primary school, because you knew that the greatest impact has to happen at those earlier stages. We start looking at sort of implementing these values, especially our coaching programs come in at 15 to 16 years old, and actually you can have these conversations much sooner, because what I find I'm doing in most of my work at 14 to 16 is undoing all of the work that's happened since they were 5. So why not go in at 5 and start building in these really interesting foundations, start teaching them values, and the way you described it was to give them a vocabulary of the values, a vocabulary of empathy, because that's what's missing. So I thought that was really interesting. Your description of school, the difference between state school and private school. Actually, I think if you dropped someone into the education system today, it still looks and feels very much like it did in 1870. That you'd said that in 1870 that the state school was set up to create clerks of the country that could spell and write and do things adequately and just get jobs done, and that the private school and the public school is where leaders were created, the strategists. And I think that's really interesting, and that to me reminds me of the UK military, where we create the soldiers and the cadets, and they learn how to run and jump and get fit and do things. And then at Sandhurst, you've got the leaders and the strategists there. And the way I've always thought about education in that sense is that with soldiers, they can shoot a gun, and with leaders, they know when and why. And that is exactly what's happening in the school system as well. We've still got this situation of the haves and the have-nots. That state schools, the ones that I work in, most definitely are there to create workers. We want people who know how to work. They know how to get up and go to places on time. They know how to learn by rote, to do what they're told, to be adequately educated so that they can get on, but not too much that they can think too much for themselves, because God forbid we have people thinking and feeling. So everything that you were talking about in that first 30 minutes of the video just struck so many chords with me. One of the great sentences you said was that your mission that you picked up on quite early was to give the best possible education to all young people to ensure that humanity flourishes. And I think as missions go, that's a pretty good one, Neil. And I think that just unlocks everything. And that should be what everybody in education is doing. Sadly, I just don't see it being that way. And then the sort of the final big point that I picked up on was that when you were talking about leadership, is that the schools that you work in now, and whenever you're talking about leadership, is to define a hierarchy of roles, not a hierarchy of relationships. And you'd noted that schools always have those boards with a picture of the chairperson at the top, the head teacher, the deputy head, and it comes down in those sort of hierarchical trees. And I see that everywhere, and I just think it's so pointless. It's just a pointless way of just indoctrinating young people that they have to be looking up to these people, and yet they haven't been taught why. There's been no introduction here as to why that hierarchy exists. It's just you have to do as you're told, and this is the way it is. So when we go in and teach our programs, we start to unpick all of that, and you start to see pennies dropping and cogs spinning, and young people start to pick apart the very fabric of the buildings that they're in. And that to me is a really interesting process that we deliver in our not-for-profit. So that was really the introduction of the interview, and I thought it just set the scene really well. And then you went on to describe the difference between values education and values-based education. So from what I understand of your description was that values education is teaching young people what values are, what those values mean, but values-based education is teaching them the context of what they are, why they exist, and more importantly, how to use them. And this is, again, going against this UK school system where we're just encouraging young people to memorize, learn by rote, and do as they're told. And this values-based system is encouraging young people to reflect. You described it as being aware, being conscious, sitting in it, taking time to reflect. And that's really interesting to me because I deliver these schools programs. They're only 1 hour a week. We don't get much time with our young people, and it's just for 10 weeks. But the transformation we achieve in that short time is incredible. And it all changed because we put in 10 minutes at the end where they just sat and reflected and thought and took some time. And the sessions are so fast paced, they're activities, there's lots of noise, there's lots of fun. And then we brought in this 10-minute buffer zone at the end where they would just sit and we would talk about what worked well and what could have worked better. We helped them reflect. Sometimes they would sort of write down or journal on their own and just sit in the learning. And the change that made was palpable. You could actually see the point in our program when we started to introduce that. And actually we then found out that these gaps are really useful for neurodivergent young people because most of them, without being too generalistic, they will have processing challenges. They need a little bit of extra time to process what's happened. They very quickly become overwhelmed, particularly with multi-sensory information, lots of things happening, lots of stuff going in, and just giving them 10 minutes at the end of a session to just sit and be quiet is absolutely incredible. And I know that you talked about that and you've built it into what you do, and I just thought it's really interesting that we've never met and we've never actually worked together, and yet we're putting in these similar systems. We're learning from what's happening, and we're doing very, very similar stuff. I think that's really, really interesting. There's another part of what you talked about which resonated was the three hearts. So you talked about having the physical heart that beats in your body, the spiritual heart that you would call the soul or your consciousness. The third heart is this emotional center where the values live. And we actually teach using head, heart, and hand, which sort of goes very similarly, where you've got the theory, the thought, and the doing. And without those three things, our workshops just don't function. And these young people actually need to understand that those three hearts are actually really, really useful and really important as a part of learning. And then I think one of the final points that you talked about there was, what is the point of education? And that's something we'll hopefully come back to throughout this entire talk, is what is the purpose of it? What is the purpose of schooling, and what is the point of learning at the moment, particularly in the UK, where I don't think we're doing a fantastic job of understanding what that was. And your final point that I've underlined here was how to keep politicians out of education. And I've underlined that because that's something we're grappling with on our side as well. So one of the challenges I think that we're all facing here, and if I can take some time now to reflect on what you were talking about, was understanding who the stakeholders were. That's something I've been grappling with, and background for the people who are here, I'm a teacher, I'm an educator. I left school and after dropping out of university because I was told to do business studies with computer science and hating it, I meandered for 10 years doing really, really crappy sales and marketing jobs, completely lost. I had good grades, I'd worked really hard at school, no idea what to do with that information, just completely lost. And I ended up at 30 years old getting back into filmmaking and photography, became a photographer, started my own production company, and ended up going around the world as an adventure and expedition cameraman and filmmaker. And I made my own documentaries in East Africa and all over Asia. And all the way through that was a lot of youth work and a lot of mentorship. And a lot of the programs I worked on and films I made were all about developing young people. So I'd kind of come full circle. I knew that I wanted to be a creative person. I loved communication like you, Neil. I loved telling stories. And I also wanted to help young people. I wanted to give them a chance. And I didn't want any more young people to leave school with all of this information and knowledge and absolutely no way of utilizing it. No one telling them where to put that and what to do with it. And I think that was the essence of what we started to do with our schools program. Help young people to make sense of what they're learning and then contextualize it. So what I thought was most interesting, if we could go out to the group now and ask a question, if you wouldn't mind, because I'm really curious about this. Is that a good time to do it?
Well, what I'm just going to do is ask Neil if he wants to reflect, well, feedback on anything that you've said so far, and then can we go to your question?
Yeah.
Is that all right? Yeah. Neil, do you have some thoughts you want to feedback on that? You're muted at the moment.
There
There
we
you
are.
go.
I'm here.
Yep, we
Um,
can.
well, first of all, Paul, apologies if my internet goes slightly. I've had a couple of warnings that my internet is slightly unstable. Hopefully, I'm not unstable, but the internet might be. Jonathan, I'm deeply honoured that you listened to that interview with with your intellect and your heart. I felt you drew out some really interesting, great points, and it made me realize how I always say when I give a talk, you give not one talk, but you give the number of talks of the number of people in the room, because everybody listens to you from their own perspective, from their own mindset, from their own backgrounds, and everybody knows that. But I think you underscored that. I think all speakers should really have someone listening to them, or two people, and say, well, this is what we heard you say, Neil. And I think that's really helpful. But Jonathan, thank you. Thank you for sharing your journey too, and seeing the likeness of your journey to mine. Yes, you're right. School systems, particularly in the last 25 years, have focused on a narrow range of, of things, and therefore have missed people so glaringly, you know. One of the things I'm told I have is intuition that's a little more, I won't say advanced, but I've got too much of it apparently. I can walk into a room and sense what's going on. And it's those sort of range of internal skills, dispositions that education systems generally miss, I think. And I liked you drawing attention to talent, and you know, they said I was talented because I could get up and speak, and I only can do that because of my grandmother. My grandmother was a Victorian lady, and as a little boy, she would sit with me and she would develop my oracy by asking questions. What do you think, Neil? What's this? So I was useless at everything at school, but I was really good at speaking because grandma developed my oracy skills, which to this day I thank her for. So not too much normal intelligence, but a lot of language. And that's interesting because back in the 1970s, there was an academic at Liverpool University in England called Eric Midwinter, and he showed how middle class, as he framed it, children were often seen as the more intelligent at school, and only because they had an extended language code. And children from disadvantaged backgrounds didn't have that code. So I think grandma gave me an extended vocabulary. So I spoke in a way that made people assume I was well educated, but no, not really. So coming back to the values thing, values-based education is a form of character development. That's what it is. And it's the way that I discovered, because as I said in the interview, way back, I was wondering why children were entering school with less of a vocabulary of words such as respect, tolerance, and all those sort of words. And I thought, well, science has its vocabulary, mathematics has its vocabulary. Why aren't we giving children more of this? Some people would say, well, the parents were giving this vocabulary, but I was thinking, well, less and less. Did the children seem to act, behave on a vocabulary, unless they were sort of controlled in a draconian way? So that's why I did this huge experiment, teaming up with Oxford University, and I took over a school as the head teacher in England, and the staff and I looked to see, well, would anything happen? What outcomes would there be on their characters if you actually gave them a richness of this ethical vocabulary? So we did that, and as I said in the interview, the results were really outstanding, and that's why Professor Terence Lovett in Australia, the Australians were looking to develop a form of values education, and he came over to see what was going on in my school, and it became the gold standard for the development of values in the 2000s to 2010, before the Australian government threw it all out because they wanted a back to basics thing. And they now say it's been a complete failure. So that's why I'm spending more time in the Southern Hemisphere now, because they want to go back to where we were, which is amazing. So if you're around long enough, you will see. One thing is, I do want to emphasize the difference between values education and values-based education. You've got almost it right, Jonathan. But the point was that to this richness of vocabulary, which was community inspired, and I've worked with so many communities worldwide, they always come up with a similar list of what we call values or character traits. If I'm in the States, I don't use the word values, I use character traits. So they always come up with a similar list. Now, the point about values-based education is the school has to say, we're going to work with these values across everything. So all the policies that the school writes are, you have to cross-check with the values of the school. As you mentioned, the photographs, where people park their cars, is there a hierarchy? So you're looking at every single aspect, how the school, the atmosphere of the school, everything is looked at. Now, the biggest point from our research, both Terry's and mine, was that actually the biggest effect initially is on the adults, not the children, because the adults change. They suddenly say, well, suddenly we don't have a battle with the students. Now we've got relationships. If we've got relationships, now the teaching flows. What happens? Academic results go up. Characters are better. Children have more agency. It's incredible. But the key too, besides the ethical vocabulary, is making sure you referred to this, Jonathan, the reflective practice. When I started doing this in the 90s, I had to be very careful because mindfulness wasn't about, and I didn't want the school community to think I'd gone wildly Eastern by getting the children to sit like this in the assemblies in their classes. So I talked about silent sitting, reflection, And I did, as you said, get the children to actually learn about their internal world, because most of life, and life in my lifetime, I don't in listeners, that speeded up. Everything's so quick.
Mm.
If I go back to when I started being a teacher, I could go into 5-year-olds, 6-year-olds, and they would all look at you, waiting for you to speak. And you say, well, I'm here to read a story today or whatever. And they generally would all be very malleable. Now they're like little rockets. And we all have to entertain like mad, and we have to keep the pace going. And if you look at television, I was talking to a key TV producer the other day, and he said, Neil, we've got to do little bite-sized flashes now to hold the attention of children and adults. So most TV programs are put together with a very short intro, and then something has to happen that grabs your attention. So the brain is being rewired. I worked a lot in the Southern Hemisphere with Professor Mark Williams, the famous neuroscientist, and he's saying, our brains have just been, of young people, are being totally rewired, as you all know. So values-based education, as I name it, and sometimes I don't want to use that title. I could use other titles, because once you use the title, people say, oh, we don't, in France, I can't say values because they go, oh, no, you can't have values. It's the church, it's this. And so you have to watch your narrative. And the last thing I'll say is on narrative. I've recently been in Vietnam and working there and having a bit of holiday there. And they were saying how in southern Vietnam, the curriculum of schools has had to be rewritten in the victors, that's the North, language. And so what really happened doesn't happen. It isn't happening because, and I'm only mentioning that because values-based education, as Mary's character education does, it develops critical thinking. It gets people to be aware. It makes them courageous advocates that will speak out when Trump is rewriting history now, and everybody sits back. We saw this in 1930s Germany. I am a revolutionary of the heart. I will speak out against people, and I did at the United Nations, who are telling lies. But because we're not educating children to be consciously aware, to be really educated, but going back, Jonathan, to what you said, to be just agents of the state, you nearly got it right again. The thing in the 1870s was that the children in state schools had to clerk the empire. The globe was red, Canada was red, it was British. So all these clerks had to do it. And as you rightly said, Jonathan, the children in public schools were the leaders. A lovely book that all of you might like to read is a book called Posh Boys, which really does show how these poor kids were desensitized in order to rule the empire. So lastly, before I shut up, values-based education is a pedagogy. It's a pedagogy. It's a whole school, whole approach. It's not a program that we do. It's when the whole school, and what I see from the hundreds, if not thousands, of values-based schools around the world now, is that this has an incredible energy, which is an intellectual energy and a spiritual energy, which is quite mind-blowing, really. But we've all got to wake up. We've got to do something. I've been saying for the last 10 years, we're at a minute to midnight. Talk about the flourishing of humanity. I'm really fearful for humanity at the moment. Thank you, Paul.
Okay, good. So, Jonathan, do you want to, because Jonathan did the first sort of overview and reflections, I asked him if he wanted to suggest a question to ask in the breakout. Jonathan, what was a question you wanted people to use to stimulate the discussion?
Just inspired by what Neil has just said, so a final reflection, if that's okay, which will lead us very nicely into this question as well. What you've just described there was how the programs or the stuff that you're delivering is not a program. It's got to infiltrate the entire education system. And when I started putting this program together, I didn't know it would get to the point it is now. We just came in to reinvigorate the teaching of business, to go in and teach young people what business is, what it does, and maybe start their own small businesses. And whilst doing that, we realized we had such an impact on these young people that we then started to expand the program. And we work with predominantly young people who would be described as challenging or disruptive at school. So they're the young people that the teachers don't want in their room because they're too noisy, because they're upsetting the other students, they're disrupting the curriculum. And when we get them in a room together, we have between 20 and 30 of these disruptive, challenging young people. Any teacher that came in the room at the beginning of our program would just suck air over teeth in fear of what was about to happen, because you've got the most challenging, disruptive young people all in the same room, boxed in with only one exit. And to this day, we've never had an issue. I've never had any disruption. I've never seen any challenging behavior. We've had warnings that our students are violent, that they lash out, and we've not seen it. And actually, we now have teachers asking us, how is this happening? Why are they putting their chairs away at the end of the session, clearing away? Why are they not running out of the school gates? Why are they turning up early to our sessions? Why are they so engaged? What are we doing that's different? And actually, what we're now doing is working with the teachers. Because there was a point in your video where you talked about maybe school is creating some of the issues that it's trying to solve. And one of those particularly was around mental health and around these young people being challenging. Is that the teachers that you were talking about said that there was a new crisis of disruptive and challenging behaviour. But I do firmly believe that school has a very large role in creating those issues and those problems. So the whole system is creating the problem it's trying to solve. And it made me think of that quote that I think has been attributed to Einstein, but I don't think it is. That if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a mountain, it will live its whole life believing it's stupid. And I feel that we're doing that so much with these young people, that we're measuring the wrong thing. Actually, if you don't need to be teaching these young people all the time, you need to give them the space to express themselves. And what we do, that we don't teach business, what we do is create a completely new environment. In that classroom, we call it international waters. Because once they go through the door, it's the classroom they've been in before, all the rules are different. They can call me Jonathan, they can take their shoes off if they want to, they can get their phones out. They do, they've never used it to this day. They don't have to ask me if they want to go to the toilet. I mean, come on, it's just go to the toilet. We treat them like grown-ups and we give them massive amounts of respect and dignity, and we treat them the same way that you would treat somebody you met in the park or in a cafe or in a bar. So often when I'm teaching in schools and we meet other teachers who aren't involved in our program, they are so disrespectful to the students that if they were my kids that were being spoken to like that, they would be pulled out of that school immediately. These teachers would never talk to a child that way in public. They would never do that in a park. They would never do it if they met them in a supermarket. But for some reason, there is an unspoken rule when a teacher's at school with these young people, that this hierarchy of relationship comes in, and they have this immense power that they wield, and they set the rules. And if the student isn't abiding by those rules that they've set, they're disruptive and challenging, and that's just wrong. So the fact that we've never seen challenging and disruptive behaviour is purely because there's nothing to disrupt. They're leading the class. They're defining success. We say at the beginning, you're going to get out of this what you want. Only you know if you've passed or failed. You figure out what you want and we'll help you get there. And part of that teaching comes from massive amounts of failure. In our workshops, we want stupid questions. I want you to feel uncomfortable being wrong. I want you to go wrong. I want you to fail. I want you to push yourself and do things horribly wrong, and then we'll learn from it. School doesn't have that capacity. When you fail, it's normally in an exam, and then you get a grade. You don't learn from that. They tell you this is what you know, and this is how good you are at that, instead of saying, this is where you went wrong, let's see what you need to get you up to 100%. You failed here, let's learn from it. It's this finite, rigid testing system that just fails so many young people. So for us, those values come from us living them. We are living those same values. And I'll finish this point before the question with an anecdote of my old high school, which I won't name, but you could probably find out quite easily. I went back to undo some of the harm that I felt was imposed upon me from that very poor career advice. I thought I'd go back and deliver the program and help a small group of young people to not have to suffer that same fate. So I went back to my school 20 years later. There's a brand new, huge mural on the wall in the reception, massive, the school logo, and at the top is the word respect. Those letters must have been a foot high each. Respect, which is great. As I walked through to my classroom to meet my students for the first time, outside in a mobile classroom, I found them lined up by an unknown teacher, like a firing squad, being barked at, screamed at, and shouted at the end of a break, humiliated in front of all of their friends, because she didn't know why they were hanging around outside this classroom, but they were there to meet me, and it was locked. They had every reason to be stood there, but because she thought they were just being disruptive and loitering, she absolutely rollicked them. And it was really humiliating and quite awkward. One young boy was told off for having his hood up when it wasn't raining. And I don't know when that became naughty to have your hood up when it wasn't raining. I don't know at any point in your life where that's going to be a value that needs to be imposed upon you, that you can't put your hood up. Turns out that was his protective hood because he had massive social anxiety. In a new room full of new people with a new teacher, that was his protective hood, and we were denying it to him. So I went back to the school to ask them why respect didn't actually, that value wasn't imposed upon the teachers. Why was it only being taught to the young people? Why do they have to respect your rules, but you don't have to respect them? And during that 10-week program, I made 2 official complaints about 2 different teachers for being so utterly disrespectful to the young people. And I think that's the success of our program comes from the fact that we are living and breathing the values that we are trying to teach these young people about respect and dignity, and they reflect it back to you. They reflect the energy of the teacher. And I will tell you, the second a teacher walks into our classrooms, everything changes. The energy shifts, the students change because they know they're about to be taught. And for us, we never use that word. We coach and nurture and help young people come to their own learning and their own understanding. And the second a teacher comes in and starts shouting, they revert back to being young people again, naughty kids who just want to get out of that classroom. So I think that what you were talking about in that interview just really struck a chord, that I think you're doing a really fantastic thing here, that these shouldn't be programs, these should be widespread understandings, and it should be delivered at community level. And I know that's what you're doing as well. So that's my rant over of where we're at.
Yeah.
But I think it's important for us.
Before Paul, you come in again, can I just make a comment on that? And
Yeah.
Jonathan, you're talking about secondary education in what you're talking about. And I'd just like us to differentiate. There are 2 different worlds, in my view, all around the world. When you talk about primary education up to 11 and then secondary education. Secondary education in most developed countries is a business. It's a way of getting children through exams so they can feed the economic situation. Primary schools in many countries are not like that. So that's why I focused on the early years of education, so that you inspire the children at that age so they can go through the exam factory. And what our evidence is they come out at the end with what we gave them when they were younger. So I just wanted to differentiate, and I think we ought to say there are some marvelous examples of secondary schools that aren't like what you've described too. I think it would be unjust to paint the picture that all secondary schools have teachers who shout, etc. I could take listeners to many secondary schools where that doesn't happen. But I take your point. In the British, in the English system, not British, English system, that's been more likely because the teachers are under enormous pressures by the inspection regime, etc., to deliver exam results, and they get better. Their mental health is really not very good. So I just wanted to make those points, Paul. Thank you.
Yeah, I've also been to many schools that are absolutely fantastic. And actually, the schools that I find have the highest or best performing students in our program have teachers that share our values already. And I think one of the points here is that we keep talking about fixing the education system. And there's been lots of curriculum reviews, but actually there's not enough about teaching teachers how to teach now and giving them that support and giving them the space that they can sit and reflect. They just seem to be victims of the system, that whatever changes we want to bring in, they have to deliver. And I don't think they're given enough agency to teach the way that they want to. There's also a danger here that you teach the way that you learned, and that we are just repeating systems. And we need to break the cycle. I don't know a single teacher that doesn't want to change the lives of young people. I don't know a single teacher that really feels they're doing that job adequately because the system doesn't allow for it. And what's most frustrating is that everybody, and I will say everybody I've spoken to, except maybe one person in the last couple of years, doesn't want to make things better, doesn't want to make the education system absolutely stellar and fantastic in this country. What's frustrating is that we don't know where the levers are. It was one of the points I wanted to bring up at some point, is where are the levers of change? If there is a system made up of millions of people in this country that want to change things, then why aren't they? Why aren't more things happening? When everybody in it, on the edges of it, looking in, mums, dads, carers, kids, teachers, they all want things to change.
I think
But
we're
it,
going to, John, I think we're going to come back to explore that probably a bit
yeah,
later on. If we can move to the breakout with the question, that'll be great. Because
yeah,
I'm sure Mary's got loads that she wants to say as well. So when we come back, we'll hear from Mary as well. Um, we've been listening so far. I can't help but reflect on everything that's been said as it relates to the way we behave in the workplace. And it seems like education is perfect training for the workplace that exists today, because all the complaints and all of the issues that you've just been describing in the education system are ones that you hear in the workplace about not being listened to, about trying to work out where the levers of change might come from,
yeah.
about being disrespected, all those kind of things. So yeah, that's quite just fascinating to reflect on the connection between the two, I think. We'll maybe come back to that. So your question was
Yes. So, Neil, you talked in your interview about this head teacher, or a job position where the advert said recently burned down, and you took the position at a school that had tragically burnt down and was being rebuilt. So it obviously was a tragedy. You saw great opportunity in that. So what I'd like to know, perhaps if we started with you, Neil, is if the entire UK education system burnt down and we were all safe and nobody was harmed, what would you save first? What would you let burn completely? And what would you want to rebuild in a new education system? Is there any part of it that's worth salvaging? Is there one part that definitely has to be eradicated? And what brand new thing would you build back if you could start the education system from scratch in the UK again? Where
well,
would you
not
be?
just in the UK, but any education
Yeah.
system anyway, because given the fact that the audience is going to be international.
Sure.
Okay, so 10 to 15 minutes. I'll say 15 minutes. Okay, and then we'll come back. Everybody's back. So I hope that was useful. Can we? We'll just spend a short time on what reflections came out of the two sessions, because I want to get on to having a conversation, get Mary's reflections as quickly as possible as well. Who would like to maybe just say what came out of your group?
Sure. Okay. Yeah, we had a great conversation. It was really super. It was so my notes aren't really organized, so I'll just sort of fly over a few things. So the idea of business people now passing on resources to kind of help others, that we need flourishing indices going forward. That would really align things, including education, like what, and then quality, like the pursuit of quality instead of profit as being also kind of a attractor, with money as an outcome of that done well. And and then and then what happened, Philip made the point that understanding like basics like soil health, like at this point we need education also to address the real kind of, gritty, challenges of sustainability right now. Like it's not an optional topic, it's for us all. And Mary talked about how it get really troubling that we have lots of people with different, you know, indices and assets and resources and things, but we're not really pulling them together. Why are we not acting on kind of what we know and what we have in place? And that there's also a lot of strength in the system, the teachers and people who want to do good work, and the structure sometimes is what's holding them back. I might not be doing good fairness here to stuff, but and I love the keystone. Maybe you'll have it in your remarks, Mary, but it's, that idea that there has like character as a keystone. Short conversation around, is values the same as character? So maybe you guys will get into that. And the systemic approach is being really, really important. And then at the end, I talked about how important it is not to bemoan too much, because we need to be more resourceful and see that there's lots of assets in the system, and it's the combinatorial and the attractor of what it is we actually like, essential needs, like things are going to get a little more crazy. So what, when people start saying what really matters here, and that will start to align a lot of learning and resources and people. There's no start with, I said, there's no start with young people. We have to start everywhere, it's politicians, it's business people, it's the civic sector, it's adults, it's everybody, needs this kind of learning. And group, is there anything that you would like to underline or that I didn't mention, please?
That's a thumbs up from Mary. Philip,
Okay.
you're muted. I think you're trying to say something. You're okay as well. Okay. What about the other group? Does anybody want to just give a quick summary of what came out of the other session?
I can briefly mention a couple of things, if that's helpful, Paul.
Sorry, could you repeat that?
Yeah, it's David here, so I can mention a few things that came up just quickly, but obviously others.
Okay.
I mean, we were trying to work out what would build back, what would salvage, and I'm not sure we, in our brief discussion, found anything particularly that would have been salvaged. But we're looking at leverages of key leverage points. One of the things that came up was around the being more explicit about purpose, moving to more flourishing and well-being. And again, re-emphasising the point that the earlier group, Lynn, just mentioned, that we need some explicit measures to that. And it's quite shocking in the UK that we've had a children's wellbeing and schools bill without a wellbeing measure in it, which is one of the things we did point out to the government and we're dealing with to try and to get them to reverse that and to fix it. But the other thing was becoming more explicit about purpose. And the other thing is around governance and moving to more of a leadership rather than a management micromanagement model, and focused on the right things to drive rather than dysfunctional things like league tables and individual exam results that create competitive practices rather than collaborative practices, and the development of values-based education and human-based skills that we'll need in the future in a world where AI is about to hit, because obviously there's a disruptive system coming in called AI at the same time, and the education system needs to understand how it embeds that in the right way, because rather than ignore it, because it cannot be ignored, because the workplace is already using these things heavily.
Okay. Can I ask Neil if you want to just quickly reflect on anything that have been said in the responses, and then we'll hand over to Mary shortly. You're muted at the moment, Neil. Sorry.
No, I don't think so. Let's go on to Mary.
Okay, good. So, Mary, do you want to? I think it's probably good if you could just very briefly introduce yourself, so then people know the context of what you're saying,
Sure,
and then just give your reflections.
sure. So Mary Crossan, I'm a professor at the Ivy Business School where I've been now 40 years. So I have quite a long kind of span of understanding organizations. My area of specialty was in strategy, strategic renewal, culture, values, organizational learning for the first 25. And then in the last 15, and I won't bore you with the details about how we got into it, but stumbled across character 15 years ago. And the piece that I'll share with you as I transition into my thinking about this is I'm always motivated by what is it we're missing? Why can we not move the needle on these things that we've known for a long time? Like values have been around forever. Why is it, troubling? Purpose, that's been there for a long time. Triple bottom line, systems thinking, organizational learning, like I've lived through them for decades. So the piece that I'm going to share with you is a perspective around character. But before I do, let me speak about Neil's podcast, which I loved. I actually got to watch it a couple of times, Neil. First, as I was, transitioning into the podcast that I was about to do with Paul, and then when he asked me to speak specifically to it, I went back through it and listened again. So maybe that's two people. I'm not sure if it's one person that heard it, but maybe it's two people. I don't know
Depends
on
whether
that
it was
measure.
before or depends whether it was before or after your coffee.
Yes, it could be. It could be. And, to use this time well, I want to focus more briefly on the things that we are aligned with and then get provocative because, we're speaking to the choir here. Like what with the things that I think we all agree with are things like agency. Wow, the power and potential of agency. I've always liked Viktor Frankl's quote. And so when you talked about man's search for meaning, between stimulus and response, there's a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. And in that response lies our growth and our freedom, choice, agency. And by the way, it's been attributed to Frankl, but I've never found it in his book, Man's Search for Meaning. So the thing is, I think Frankl underestimated the strength of character required to choose. And so for me, agency is about choice. It's about a choice that I think the things that we've done well in education and organizations is the competency side. So one of the things we talk about is how can we elevate character alongside competency, which Neil was something that you were also picking up in your podcast. So we agree on vocabulary. I mean, it's one thing that we spent a lot of time trying to get the vocabulary sorted, and I'll speak a little bit more to that. We have really a lot of alignment on this, what we call disposition to lead, which gets into the agency. How does the individual flourish and bring the best of themselves, regardless of the context that they're in? I think this notion of meaning and purpose and how much that can ignite the learner is really important. And as we look into character, I think we see being purposive and inspired. How do I become somebody who's purposive, inspired is one of the pieces that is really important. Reflection, another piece, really important. Awareness. These are all really critical aspects. And yet what I've also found as I start to transition into the things that we miss, reflect about what, become aware about what. And what we have found is the more concrete that we can give in the architecture about how people understand character, the greater the likelihood that we actually get some grounding in it. I'll just share my own background. I think about, I grew up in an educational system that I think values were really prevalent. I think they were there. I grew up in a family where values were very, very, very strong. And actually, until I understood character, it was not, that was the point, the turning point for me about what I think we were getting wrong or missing about it. And if I could, maybe, a picture may be worth 1,000 words. So let me just share a couple of things to get us going here. When we're thinking about character, we're really thinking about character as an anatomy. And so we've made a part here, Neil, on the fact that we don't enter into either an educational setting or into organizations asking people, like values, people can value what they want to value. It's like a strategic alignment thing. I don't mess with values. But what I do say is, regardless of the values that you have, like you value integrity, every organization does, what is the character foundation that underpins it? And so what we try to start with is an architecture that says vocabulary matters. So let's work with the vocabulary. Let's see what we didn't see. The next part that may be a little bit different than where you were coming at it is, I think we're underestimating character as habit. It's habit development. And if we bring an understanding of education, not just learning and knowing something, but actually bringing the architecture of habit and the science of habit development, which is, why I mentioned my daughter Corey's work at Oxford. She did her PhD in kinesiology, bringing exercise science perspectives on how do you actually develop character as a lifelong journey. And I think, again, we're underestimating what we're not getting right or not seeing is understanding. In this case, you'll just see there's a development cycle about what it takes to develop character, and bringing that architecture. And then finally, it is understanding that just developing character of individuals is not going to be sufficient. We need to embed it in our organizations. We need to embed it in the fact that organizations don't select on character. Well, maybe they should. Or if I think about the university, every time I used to sit on the Senate, and Western University, big university, about 40,000 students, would be celebrating that we have the highest incoming average of students, right? We're celebrating academic grades. And what I talk about is, but what about the character of the individuals? Who's measuring that? Who's assessing that? And if we are not doing that at the university level, then we're not creating the appetite and the encouragement all the way down the educational system that it isn't just about grades. So people would say to me, because I was heavily into sports, I coached my kids' volleyball teams, they were into music, and they'd say, you're a university prof, why are you letting your kids do all of these sports and music? And I said, because that's where they're going to develop their character, not so much sitting in a classroom learning math or science, but it's, learning piano and dedicating themselves to that and understanding the perseverance and tenacity that has to go along with that, or in their sport. So what I want to pick up here is that the idea that we want to embed character into our systems. I love the fact, for example, that we now have in looking at the ranking systems of universities that there's a measure on character. How well are universities, educating on character? And so I just want to maybe pick up two really key points about this language of character. In our case, by the way, we're building on the shoulders of giants: Confucius, Aristotle, Plato. Martin Seligman did an 800-page research book, Character, Strengths, and Virtues. Took us 6 years to use an engaged scholarship approach, bridging theory and practice, to develop a framework that would be robust, that we could assess, develop, and measure character. But here's a piece I also want to bring in that I think we're missing. In the language of, values and the way we treat things, we don't pick up what Aristotle talked about is that any virtue can operate like a vice in deficiency or excess. So if I take even something, like you, John, you talked about respect. Well, people think about, being disrespectful as a deficient vice, but if we look at the excess vice of being respectful, we can get into fawning, right? It's this idea that we often see even in some of the Eastern cultures where I've taught in Asia, this sort of, bowing to authority in a way that one would argue might be an excess vice state of respect. And so when we think about the art and science of character, and it's not just a vocabulary then, it's this sort of learned habitual approach of living a life that where one begins to understand deficiency and excess. And my experience, this particular table is gold. It is the place where there's nobody that I know that doesn't say they have good character, that they are not a person of good character. But when we think about character as, the virtuous states like walking on a balance beam, tough, very tough, right? That there's a deficient and an excess side. What's your lean? And knowing that you will have a lean, and then asking yourself, what is that lean and under what conditions does it happen? And this is where I think people, teachers, students, educators, professors, leaders can look at themselves and, to the point that you raised, Neil, reflect on what? Reflect on the fact that what they thought might be a virtue could be operating in a vice state. And that's where we can start to course correct, I think, around that. John, I go back to the example that you gave of that teacher who was berating the children. That's not a competence issue. That's a character issue. That's some imbalances of what's going on, the scripts that somebody has been operating with and saying, well, keeping kids in line is really the way to teach them. There's a script, right, that's operated about that. That's a principle that they've learned, but they haven't actually, addressed. And maybe the last thing that I might share is, picking up, Neil, on the three hearts that you had talked about, and a piece that we also pick up around character that I think is critically important is that there are four big systems underpinning character development, of which you picked up on, two of them, right? Affect, our feeling, emotion, and mood. Cognition, of course, that many of us are already knowing about, but we often forget about physiology. And so, when you talk about having a student in stillness, for example, understanding that it's not just about their cognitive function, it's about their physiology, right? It's about stilling a physiology. And so when we begin to think about education, and particularly character education, it's beginning to think about different methodologies. We use music to activate character. We know that music can calm people. We know it can give them adrenaline. So can we be more conscious? Back to this, it's a word that's come up quite a bit. Be conscious about how we're activating character, perhaps in the classroom. So I'll pause there. I know I've gone on a bit long, but hopefully it's given something to think about.
Okay, yeah, it certainly has. I'm going to first let Neil respond. Quite a lot to respond to there, but if you could try and respond fairly quickly on that, Neil, so that others can get their thoughts in as well. And I'm pleased to see that Glenn's also managed to join us. I think managed to sort out his duties with grandchildren now to join us at the end there, so we'll be able to chip in a bit too. Neil, over to you.
Yes, I think I thank you, Mary. That was exquisite, and having listened to your talk twice myself now, I really do think I understand your wonderful work, and so thank you very much, and thank you for listening to me twice. I can't even listen to myself once. I think, I come back to this point, values-based education is an engine house for developing character. if you can look online and you'll see me talking about Aristotle, and I take courage and I say, if you have too much of it, you're foolhardy, and if you haven't got enough, you're a coward. I do all that sort of work because values-based education develops character. When I'm talking in businesses, I talk to them about you can understand someone's character if you ask them some questions about how they put their values into action. So its action is definitely what I would focus on. The schools that are really into the values-based work do something I call courageous advocacy, and that is it's no point to just having this vocabulary if you don't do something with it. There's a marvelous little school that wrote to me yesterday who's getting its children to write to members of parliament about things they don't agree with. Another school in Luton in the Midlands area of the UK was on a march last week on equal opportunities because they wanted to show the town how they were actually using their values. There's a school in Morecambe that wrote to the local council and said, why aren't you repairing the war memorial? The council said, well, we haven't got any money. So the children went into raising money and they shamed the council so much that the council then repaired the war memorial. So I'm very into this, Mary and I are really talking about the same thing. It's all about character. It's all about how you create characters that will be in themselves able to be stable and lead, inverted commas, a happy, fulfilled life, and also be productive citizens and have good character. Mary says about it's not about values, but if you look at her chart, she has a chart with, isn't it, 11 values? If a value is a principle that guides our thinking and behavior, there are values that go round. Now, I know that lots of academics don't like the word values. It causes a lot of problems, particularly in the United States. So I'm sensitive to why we've moved on from that. But I'd say I went to look at character education, which Lacuna got going years ago, and I visited some schools in the States, and the only thing I found were boxes of literature in a box that said character education. That isn't what I talk about with values-based education, where everything is based on these words, where you actually interrogate them. You say, well, what does it mean when a child enters the classroom? Right, you're being very respectful at the moment. So the child knows what respect is. Then you have experiential sessions where they actually interrogate what these words actually mean. But the outcome is character. Of course it is. That is it. So, as I said, I wish years ago I didn't use the term values-based education because it does cause a bit of disturbance in the academic world. I like character. I support that. Loads of schools are doing the character work in the UK too. So I think we're not in disagreement. Well, I'm not in disagreement with Mary, but it's just the language we use, I think, is important. But lastly, I'd say I totally agree with Mary. It is about what we're actually doing. But I've said at the United Nations, if we had more leaders who really understood, what ethical leadership is really about, and I haven't spoken so much today about ethical leadership, but ethical leadership is based on what you value in the world. And if you value lies, then that's what you're going to put out. So I'll stop there, but I'd like to thank Mary. I don't disagree with anything Mary has said, actually.
I think the link there is that, Mary, you talked about character being related to habits. Well, that's, the link with values then is virtues, because basically values that are lived then become virtues, and you want virtuous habits. Virtuous habits make good character, I guess, and that's probably a way of linking the different elements up here. Do you agree with that? Do you think, does that make sense? Or
it does at a high level.
Yeah.
But I'm going to be still very, very provocative with us. I think where we run into trouble is this idea that let's just construct the values that we want to live by. And I've watched that in organizations, and I've watched that in education. Whereas with the character piece, as we pick up, and it comes from virtue ethics for sure, it is understanding that they work in a constellation. It's like the anatomy of the body. It's not just about my biceps, and I can't just say I don't have biceps. I've got biceps. So the piece I want to say that I think is provocative here is that thinking about the architecture of character like the anatomy and physiology of the body, it's not something we should have up for grabs.
Yeah, they're all interdependent, interrelated with each other. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Let me just open it up to others to share their thoughts or maybe ask questions if you want. Does anybody want to go first?
I just want to pick up on this last conversation. I mean, it sort of feels to me, it's a feeling thing that values are kind of vis-a-vis something, like it's more negotiated in terms of, what's important. What I like about the idea that it's an anatomy is that it's kind of it's in the matrix of the individual and their choice making. And then the values sort of seems like to come out in situational, relational sort of, Neil. So that's what I'm thinking, if that's kind of a way to parse them. And as well, Mary and everybody.
And Lynn, the thing too, right, is that all of the 62 behaviors under the 11 dimensions of character, they're all virtuous. They satisfy a criteria. There's a lot of values we have that aren't virtuous. Like they don't satisfy the criteria. Like I value health, or I value money, or I value, so values itself as an umbrella, it covers a lot of territory. Character is very specific around a set of virtuous behaviors that are not up for grab.
Yes, it's definitely a cleaner concept. And I'm just going to look at something else. And there's a book that I got is about it's got values in the title, I think, actually, that you referred me to it, Paul. So when I see it, I'll just hold it up. Thanks.
Okay. Does anybody else want to comment? Or maybe Jonathan, do you want to reflect on what you've heard so far? Or let me just, before you do that, let me just ask if anybody else wants to comment, and then you can reflect on what they say.
I was going to say that, oh, sorry.
No, go for it.
Yeah, values, what do they relate to?
Yeah.
Could we all agree that the well-being of all of life is something that we want, that values should relate to? If we train to realize those values and teach values and be aware of values, where they're going to take us. So the well-being of all of life, not just humans, it includes nature and all of what goes on the earth. So really the values that we might have and hold and connected to character would align to the well-being of all of life. So that to me is a beacon. You point at that and you come back to see what values are going to take you there. And they're different. We're all different, obviously, but what would the values be? How can you get people to take on those values? And I would say that you have something to look at that is the well-being of all of life. And I can't get it out of my head. I keep asking the question: what in business? If you're in business, if you don't have that in the background, you end up just making money for the sake of it, and quality go down the toilet. But if you actually have to align to and embed the well-being of all of life, I just can't get away from that, man. So values have to lead to that. So it go back then to see what kind of values and character would get us to that. But that's me. This is my first time in this kind of thing, so I'm sorry if I'm speaking out of turn. But
no, that sounds fine. Mary, go on.
Well, yeah. So if I could maybe join in with, of course, I'm in a business school, right? I'm with a bunch of MBAs, and I'm teaching character leadership, and they're opting into it, right? It's almost like so many of them take it because it's a personal journey. The one thing they ask right from many of them, you're not going to tell me what to value, are you? And I'll say, no, I'm not. What I will say is that if you go to the character gym and you're working on the muscles of justice and accountability and courage and humility and humanity, you will go through an exploration of sorting through, even understanding what your values are or what they could be. So I think, Philip, where you're at, this aspiration level that people should or ought to think about something in a particular way, in my experience, the only way they go to that journey is not because you told them that that's what they should value, but rather in this idea of working through the exploration of character and its development, they work through a process of sorting that out.
Define that. It's a question, really. Do we want to go towards that? Really, I'm not saying that's what we should all do, but it's a starting point, and ask a question around it. Where, if you had the best values in the world, where would you want them to take us all, based on where we are now?
If I could just reflect on what, so earlier in the conversation, Neil made a distinction between primary education, infant, early stage education, and what John was saying about secondary school education. And Murray, you're talking about university level education. And the thing is that the stage of infanthood, early stages, they don't have, they've not been conditioned into being threatened when they've been asked, people asking them to talk about their values. They don't have the same concerns about discussing values at that stage. I think when you get older, people don't want to talk about values quite often because they wonder whether you're questioning what their values are. And so there's a difference. And I think secondary school age is kind of somewhere in between the two. So I can see that there's a need to shift it at some point because of people's conditioning at different stages of their lives, and that determines the way they respond to conversations about either values or character or whatever it might be. But I was also just going to comment, really also just based on what Philip's saying. Clayton Christensen wrote an excellent book on. The last book he wrote, I think, was "How Will You Measure Your Life," which I would recommend anybody to read. And the story behind why he wrote it was really interesting, because he found it incredibly depressing every time he went back to a reunion of people who graduated and found out how many had been in prison, how many had been divorced or become alcoholics, or and so he basically decided to teach a program to try and get people on the right track. And it's also interesting that the very original purpose of business schools was to teach character. It wasn't to teach what MBAs later became. It was to teach people the right kind of characteristics to be able to manage larger businesses. And then over time, the purpose of business school shifted away from that. And of course, 2007-8 made people refocus on what the purpose of business school really is, ought to be. And they all started bolting on the ethics courses and so on. But it's not ingrained in everything that they teach in the way that what Neil's trying to say about school is that it's about actually teaching not the values, but basically making sure that everything that's taught and the way it's taught is teaching values. Yeah, so it's about instilling the habits. So I think actually the conversation so far is interesting because I think we're pretty much agreed on what we want the outcomes to be. And there's a lot of agreement between everything that we're saying, but the conversation kind of demonstrates how the words we actually use have different meaning, even to us in this group to some extent. And a conversation probably needs to be had to explore all of that in greater detail as well. But I think as long as the intent is good, we can have that kind of conversation in a civilized kind of way and make progress, unlike what's going on in society generally these days. So I'll pause there. And I wanted to just pick up, and John, at the very beginning, you were sort of suggesting you wanted us to have a quick conversation about what we think the purpose of school ought to be. And I wonder if anybody wanted to, if shall we just explore that a little bit in the light of what's been said so far as well, and in the light of what does society want, and what do the different stakeholder groups think the purpose of school should be?
I just would love to say there very quickly, learn how this works. Heart, brain and gut together, not just brain and cerebral. So for me, school was about trying to get things into my head. And we have a heart, which we've learned, that's now got 40,000 neuroreceptors in it and carries memory, and sends more information to the brain than the other way around. So have we left the heart out of the game? So that there's a three-way thing going on: heart, gut, and mind.
And I try and partly link what you just said to in the interview I mentioned to Neil, and we discussed a bit about the definition of purpose of education, and I think it links still to what you were just saying to some extent.
Mm-hmm.
So I quoted what Charles Handy said to me in an interview about his definition of what he thought the purpose of education should be, which is training people for the life that they're going to lead. And that would require more than just knowledge. It would require all kinds of knowledge in a much broader sense than we normally think about knowledge, I guess. And in a conversation prior to today, I was having with Jonathan, we were talking about purpose of education, and you were saying, Jonathan, if I can edit this out if you don't want me to quote it publicly, but I think you were saying in all of the time that you've been working with and in schools, if I quote you correctly, you still haven't got a clue really what the purpose of education is the way it's designed today.
Yeah,
is that correct or not?
Yeah, it is. I mean, I was saying before that I'm not a teacher, I'm not an educator. I'm a communicator, and one of the things I love doing is taking really complex ideas and learning them and then communicating them so that other people can understand it. That was the basis of my documentary business. So I've entered the world of schools with this business hat on, and I spend most of my time in those schools trying to figure out who the customer is. What role are the students? Are they the product? Are they the customer? Are they the recipient? Who is this school system serving? And I think until we know who it's serving, we can't truly say whether it's working or not, because if the state school was built to create people who were of an adequate skillage and intelligence to work, then it's working fantastically well. And I think the only way we can actually shift education is if we put students at the center of it, that they should be at the center of all decisions so that they are the recipient and the benefactor of everything that goes into it. But at the moment, it is just a business. It's a self-fulfilling system that's making.
Although at the same time, lots of businesses complain that it's not producing the people that are employable, that have got the skills that they want today. Glenn, you've got your hand up. I don't know whether your comment or question was related to what we've just been saying or an earlier point that was raised.
I'm cognizant of the time, so I'll be rather brief. I do apologize for my very late joining the group. But the first point about indigenous cultures, I do a lot of work with global chieftains and indigenous cultures worldwide. And one of the complaints that the chieftains usually raise is that we teach people how to make a living. We don't teach people how to live.
Mm.
And this is, how do we connect with the heart? How do we use the heart to connect to the planet and bring the vibrations of the planet forward? So reflecting Philip's point. Second point on your note with languages, Fernando Flores goes into tremendous detail with this. in the work and some of the stuff that he does. And lastly, connecting back to Jonathan's point, I don't know whether this was discussed earlier in the talk, but taking LaRue's book and looking at a teal-based organization and how the focus of the organization is to develop the employees and develop those skills might be some very, very rough framework to consider. Thank you.
Okay, does anybody? I'm just thinking who's not spoken. I don't know whether Gary or Gary, David, or Elliot. Do you want to say anything?
Yeah, I mean, I think, the most important thing I heard from Mary and Neil and Lynn, and you touch on it a little bit, Paul, yourself, is, the only way you're going to develop values, whatever set of values you're talking about, and I think that's going to be specific to the organization, is you have to have deliberate practice in recognizing when whatever you're doing reflects those values. I mean, that's why the language is so important, right? To have a language, whatever that language is, to have some way of articulating those values allows you to then reflect afterwards on whether anything you did exemplifies those values in a positive or negative way. And then the next level of that, right, is to be able to have a way to communicate that with others. Because the conclusion I've come to in my 40 years of work in education in all kinds of different scenarios is, we almost everything we do, we learn together. So we have to learn together. And one of the ways to do that is to have a language to reflect together on some shared experience. And, it's, to me, that's the most important thing I heard from this. And I would end it just to say, I think the purpose of education should be to break down boundaries, to allow outsiders to become insiders. And that's all about this learning to learn together and coming to understand the values of whatever the organization is or culture is that you would like to enter.
David or Elliot, do you want to comment on anything?
Yeah, so a couple of things. One is I think this notion of the purpose of education, and I mentioned this in our breakout at the end when we were running out of time, but if you look back a couple of 100 years ago, I think education, there were different tracks. There were people who were being educated to go into the workforce, either trades or whatever. And then there was an elite that was being trained to go on to take over leadership and governance, whatever. As societies got democratized, we don't know what the purpose is of anymore of education. I mean, it's in some respects, in some school districts, it's taking over parental roles, and it's lost all that. So everything that was talked about, I mean, it is a broken system. In terms of values, I know when I talk to executives and particularly board members, they always kind of push back and say, whoa, 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 values. That we shouldn't be talking about that. And I go, wait a minute. Values determine what you decide in terms of everything that you're doing. Why do you decide that this stakeholder is less important than this stakeholder? Or that you're going to go and treat employees this way? It's a values decision. It's based upon how you act and make decisions. And there's a quote that Mary used one time that I use a lot and I love, is that we judge ourselves by our intent and others by their behaviors. And, when you're working with whatever group, they tend to judge themselves by their intentions rather than what they're actually doing. So a teacher doesn't intend if you say you disrespect students, I don't intend to disrespect them. I do. I don't intend, if I were in a board, to only care about shareholders, but they'll convince themselves that they have to. So we express our values through our behaviors, and we don't always understand that values are at the core of everything that guides our actions. Those are what determines. So I don't think, and I think it goes back to business school training that Mary was talking about, not to tell people what their values should be, but to explain to them that they have values that come out in every decision they make.
I would just add to what you just said and say, I think I find it quite ironic that they don't want to talk about values when they all publish mission, vision, and value statements. So what are the
Well,
value
yeah,
statements
because most
supposed to
of
be? Yeah?
most of those values are espoused values created to make the company look good rather than what they actually do.
Exactly. Yeah. We're at the end of time here, and I'm guessing people on earlier time zones and us may have other things they need to go on to. So I'm going to pull things to a close here and thank everybody for taking part today. Neil, you managed to stick with us. I see you've had a few internet connection problems towards the end there, so I'm glad you managed to stick to the end. And I'm glad that Gary was able to get a better connection towards the end there and contribute as well. Strength of character, perseverance, trying to get connections working these days. And just to let me thank also Mary for what today has been really a teaser of our next session on the salon, because we're going to do a whole session next with Mary, following on from this. And you can already see the pre-recorded interview that I've done with Mary. If you haven't seen a link to that already, it's available on YouTube. And the date for the live session is already set. I'm just trying to remember it now, and I think if I remember correctly, it's the 28th. I don't remember. You just have to check. But it's the end of the month. We've got Mary. Mary will be joining us to talk about ethics after Mary Crosshands. We've got two Marys in a row. Look out for further announcements anyway. You will see that we've got a publication associated with the salon now. So all news of when recordings of our sessions are being published, everything will be recorded and there on the salon, and we can continue the debates, discussions between the live sessions and the recordings and so on within the Salon magazine. Neil, so just thanks very much to you. Enjoy the rest of your day. You're just at the beginning. And thanks for getting up and joining us early.
Thank you.
Before my internet goes, may I thank Mary and Jonathan for their remarks. I've learned so much from you all. That's the great thing about learning. You go on learning and you don't stick.
Except when the internet connection goes and then you stick. Okay. I think we got that. Thanks very much, Neil.
Brilliant session. I've gained from it tremendously.
Right. Okay.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Neil. All the best.
Thank you.
See you
Thanks,
soon.
everybody.
Thanks very much. Cheers.
Bye.
Bye for now.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Having me.